Good afternoon, everyone. I welcome you all on another episode of India-Ireland Friendship Lecture Series. Today we have with us Ms. Gillian Harford, who is a senior HR executive with 30% Club, a global campaign supported by chairs and CEOs driving gender balance on boards and at C-suites. And Ms. Gillian works there directly with client organizations focusing on diversity and workplace change. With the encouragement of supporter organizations, she also operates as the country executive for the 30% Club. She will today share her knowledge on inspiring work of the 30% Club in enhancing gender balance in corporate leadership. Ms. Gillian is the former head of HR strategy and planning with AIB, where having a career spanning over 40 years, she has been responsible for bringing significant change in people with a particular focus on culture, career, diversity and agile work. Ms. Gillian holds a BA and MBA from Michael Smurfit Business School and a professional diploma in corporate governance from UCD. She is also a member of the Institute of Directors, Fellow of CIPD and a Fellow of the Institute of Bankers. She is a member of the board for the Central Remedial Clinic and an advisory group member for the government-based initiatives such as Balance for Better Business and the Women in Finance Charters. Before we listen to Ms. Gillian Harford, I would request His Excellency the Ambassador of India to kindly give his introductory remarks.
Namaskar, my very warm greetings to all the friends who are joining this program through virtual means and also friends who are here. For me, it's a great privilege and great joy to welcome you here. My wife Preeti and I are very delighted to meet you and learn about your very inspiring work. The field of your work is particularly interesting and particularly of great interest to me because our Prime Minister has a great vision of empowering people of India, and also his paradigm has been not the trickle down, but the direct empowerment of the weakest and the poorest and the most needy. And women occupy a central position in his development planning. He has been pursuing a policy of not treating women as just beneficiaries and recipients of government programs, but women-led development, and women being at the center of the development planning, and also schemes at every level, from the school, from the prenatal to the education and vocational skills, and encouraging women entrepreneurship, particularly the less affluent entrepreneurs and towards tier 2, tier 3 cities in India, the entrepreneurship and funding credit for small entrepreneurship. Around 60% of beneficiaries of that small credit have been women. And also thanks to a personal priority that Honorable Prime Minister Modi has given to women and gender equity. In the STEM section, girls have overtaken boys in terms of women have larger share of the university graduates and people who are joining STEM courses in India. Girls are more than the boys. At the corporate level, we had some great entrepreneurs, leaders in business. Among the startups, we are seeing very encouraging sign of women participation. India has more than about 90,000 startups and more than 100 unicorns, and we see ever-growing participation of women. But as an ambassador to Ireland, I am equally inspired by what I see in Ireland, particularly in addressing gender issues, their empowerment, and particularly giving them the those in directorship. And that is why I think it's very useful for us to have someone like you to share first-hand experience on how you have tackled issues and also how you have found new solutions, new ways of having greater women participation at the top corporate leadership level. I really hope that your lecture becomes a catalyst and it inspires more Indian women to take up those roles. And also we have very robust growing Indian diaspora. We have about 60,000 strong Indian diaspora and majority of them are professionals. And I'm also very happy to see that many Indian women who come for studies here, they are taking up technical subjects, science and technology and management and finance, and many of them are also looking at entrepreneurship. So I hope that your lecture inspires them also to do better and be more alert and take advantage of the excellent ecosystem that Ireland has nurtured. With these words, let me invite you for your presentation. We look forward to listening and also following up on what you suggest. Thank you.
Thank you to the team for that lovely introduction and that fantastic welcome. It's our pleasure to be here today, whether you're listening live or whether you're dialing in afterwards. We really appreciate the opportunity to share some ideas in the spirit of friendship, and we've really enjoyed getting to know the team here, and we hope that what I'm going to talk about today will be of some benefit. I'm here to talk about the 30% Club, but I also want to speak a little bit about Ireland and speak a little bit about gender diversity and how it might fit within the business world. There are so many groups that talk about diversity and talk about different types of diversity. Within the 30% Club, we focus on gender because we see gender as a majority issue rather than a minority issue. And we also speak from the lens of the business rather than from government, though we do see huge opportunity for us to work together. I do have some slides. There is much to keep me on track as anything else. So hopefully as I speak, it'll bring some of the slides to life. But as I said, some of them, the writing is a little bit small, but they're just for background. But I put the first one there just to give a little bit of a sense of Ireland in context and modern Ireland. So the modern Ireland that we operate in today has a population of just over 5 million people. And just over 50% of that 5 million are women. We have a really strong participation rate for women in the workplace with a rate of almost 60%. And we're still not quite sure why, but we're one of the few countries in the world where the participation rate for women actually increased during the pandemic rather than decreasing. So the idea where the media talks about the great resignation during the pandemic, we didn't experience that in Ireland. And we like to think that some of it is attributable to the huge growth at the time in more agile ways of working, and I'll come back to that later on. But despite that, in terms of representation, we still find that the number of women in very senior roles still remains at a position below where it really needs to be. We're very fortunate in Ireland that the government track information, so every 2 years they produce a survey, some of which I've put in this space, and it tells us that at the moment only 14% of chairs on the boards across all of Ireland are women. In terms of directors, just under 22%. And chief executive officers, only 13%. But yet in pockets we've been able to make progress. So as I speak a little bit about the 30% Club, our focus is on medium to large organisations, particularly organisations that are listed on the stock exchange. And when we started the 30% Club in 2015, less than 13% of those board positions were held by women. Now, based on the voluntary actions within these organisations, that number has increased to 36%. And that's by organisations setting targets, thinking about the progress that they want to make, and taking really dedicated and committed action. What we lobby for and advocate for is how do we take that action from the boardroom and move it into the leadership levels within organisations, because that's where the talent pipeline needs to sit. The most important decisions are made at the CEO table or at the board table, but the talent pipeline for that starts much earlier. And how do we encourage men and women to stay within the workplace and think about building out their career? In terms of Ireland, we do have lots of things in our favour. Education is a very, very strong aspect in Ireland, and almost all children in Ireland stay in full-time education until they're 18, whether it's academic education or vocational education. And we're really proud of the fact that more than 50% of our undergraduates from university are young women. So we see a huge investment and a commitment in education. But the numbers start to fall back with executive education and master's education. And we also tend to see women focused in certain pockets of education and career development. And I was really interested in the ambassador's figures in terms of the number of young women in India focusing on STEM subjects. And that's still an area for us in Ireland to drive greater focus on. So a lot of the initiatives in Irish companies try to look back into the school space and see what they can do to encourage young women to think about maths and science subjects from a very early age. We, as I said, we have a high participation rate in the employment workforce of women. We have a very well educated workforce, but we also have our challenges, and the main challenges that we have are in terms of infrastructure. As our population grows, housing becomes an issue in terms of talent and retaining talent in Ireland, and Ireland has historically had an emigration issue rather than an immigration issue in terms of talent and gathering and retaining talent. And like many countries around the world, we now struggle with the idea of childcare and where the balance and responsibilities of childcare lie, whether in organisations finding solutions, government finding solutions, or family finding solutions. So how do we bring a lot of these aspects together to drive change in the makeup of talent in the workplace, and making sure that we hold on to talent, male and female, not just within our organisations but within Ireland as well. For a country that's quite small, we are part of the European Union, which has driven a lot of change and progress in the earlier days. And now we like to think that we can move ahead and be a leader across Europe. If we look at the history across Ireland around driving good behaviours around gender balance and gender employment, we've had equal pay legislation since the early 1970s. We've had employment equality legislation since the early 1970s. And both of those were beneficial as part of our membership of the EU. But we have taken it a step further. So in 2018, the Irish government introduced Balance for Better Business, which is an initiative which is very complementary to the work done by the 30% Club. And it encourages employers in Ireland to set targets for gender representation and to put plans in place and be accountable for their own progress. In 2022, we also introduced gender pay gap legislation. So every employer in Ireland that employs more than 250 employees was required to disclose their gender pay gap before the end of last year. And we know from that data that Ireland has a gender pay gap of just over 12%. It's slightly lower than the EU average, but it's still not in the place that we'd like it to be. A huge advantage of the Irish legislation in terms of how it was put together was that companies have to talk about what drives their gender pay gap and also the action plan that they're putting in place to address it. And we know, based on the companies that have produced their data already, more than 500 companies produced their data before Christmas, that the gender pay gap in Ireland is not about unequal pay, but it's about unequal representation. Either unequal representation in certain sectors or unequal representation within an organisation. So we still see more men towards the top of organisations where pay is higher, more women at the lower ends of organisations. We still see more women in certain sectors, but not necessarily in the most highly paid roles. So more than 50% of employees in financial services in Ireland are women, but less than 20% of the most senior roles are held by women. Similarly, across STEM in Ireland, we still believe that only about a quarter of the roles are filled by women. So in terms of gender pay gap, as I said, it's not about equalising pay, it's not about companies paying more, but it's about companies promoting more and giving more opportunity. And these are some of the things that we drive within the 30% club. Probably prior to 2015, Irish companies weren't really talking about gender diversity quite as much as they should have been. They were speaking quite a lot about legislation and equality legislation and complying with that legislation, but they weren't really talking about diversity as part of their business strategy. And the types of things that we would hear in 2015 were, well, the talent doesn't exist. Women don't want careers. This is a very expensive thing to do. There's no value in doing this. This is a distraction from the day-to-day work. And actually, it won't really change our business. And the biggest thing that we have seen is the change in mindset. We have seen organisations now saying that these were the myths, they're not the reality. The talent is there, the business benefit is there, and actually it is an important part of the business agenda. So we now have Irish companies talking about diversity, talking about gender diversity in particular, because it makes strong business sense. So gender diverse companies are 24% more likely to outperform less diverse companies. If you then add in ethnic diversity, that 24% goes up to 33%. A higher equality, diversity and inclusion focus increases the opportunity to grow market share by up to 45%. And a higher focus improves the opportunity to move into new markets by up to 70%. So companies are now seeing that this makes business sense. So it is the combination of this is a good thing to do in terms of harnessing all our resources, but it actually makes a difference to our bottom line. And we know that when something becomes part of the business agenda and gets measured in terms of the business agenda, action starts to happen. Irish companies, when we work with them through the 30% Club, they tend to talk about the business case under 4 key areas. So the first and the most important is they see a focus on gender diversity as really important in terms of attracting talent, but also retaining talent. So we're very fortunate at the moment in Ireland, we're almost close to full employment. So there is a strong sense of power within the employee. So therefore it's really important that an organisation actually sells their brand in terms of this is a good place to come and work. And we know from research that our university graduates are very clear about the type of employer that they want to work for, the type of employer they want to start with, build their career and develop their career. And not just at the point of entry, but throughout the different stages of their lifestyle choices. So we're now seeing across Ireland that companies that aren't focusing on making sure that all talent is welcome and all talent has an opportunity to progress, they lose out in terms of recruitment, but they also lose of retention. And what this has driven is a really important factor in Ireland. We have now seen Irish companies come together to collaborate to improve the situation, whereas perhaps historically they might have competed against one another and said, let us build diverse talent and we will have the competitive advantage. But actually we just build for everyone else. So we now see industry groups, particularly in groups like the 30% Club, coming together and saying, what can we do as a financial services industry to make the industry more attractive to young women and to more career-minded older women who want to stay within the workplace? The same within STEM. The second area where we see the drive for the business case is actually from the customer perspective. Our customers expect a service that reflects their diversity. Our customers expect to see products that are designed for all customers. And I have a really good example that I use. As Emma said in the introduction, previously I worked in AIB, one of Ireland's largest banks, for a very long time. And this was something that we were always really conscious of in terms of our technology development. If you didn't have a diverse team coming together to design what was going to happen next, would you really be serving the full base of your customers? And for those of us who are a bit older and think about it, if you think about the introduction of the credit card, and some of you who are well used to the situation now where we tap our card, tapping a card works really well whether you're right-handed or left-handed. But previously you had to swipe your card down the side of the machine, which works excellently for right-handed people, but it's terrible for left-handed people. So our customers, they want to see diversity in products, diversity in thought. One of our industry groups within the 30% Club is the food and drink group, which is a very important industry in Ireland. They want to develop products of nutritional value for all types of customers. So that means that they need to reflect that in their employee base as well. The third area that's driving the business case for employers in Ireland is around the power of the investor. Investors are now very focused on sustainable organisations because that gives the safest and the strongest return on their investment. But what investors are now saying is that sustainability is not just about a green economy, a green climate. It's not just about materials and production, but sustainability is really about the strength of a workforce and the strength that applies within the workplace. So investors are now saying, we want to see what your strategy is around gender balance. We want to see that your teams are made up of different viewpoints and different backgrounds. And if we don't see that, then we will invest elsewhere, because we know that good diversity makes better business outcomes, and that's what we want as investors. And then there's the business outcomes. Again, CEOs are smart people. They're seeing that investing in gender diversity and broader diversity gives better business outcomes, so the business case becomes reinforcing. Where does the 30% Club fit within this space? So the 30% Club is a global campaign supported by chairs and CEOs of some of the world's largest organisations. And these chairs and CEOs are committed to greater gender balance for greater business outcomes. It operates in 19 countries around the world, and all of the work is done by volunteers from the business space. So as organisations sign up to support, people like me get involved as volunteers, and we work to change things in the country where we're based, but also to contribute at a global level as well. Because we focus on some of the world's largest organisations, they also tend to be global organisations, so that gives us an opportunity to speak from country to country. Our global mission is very simple. We want to have a minimum of 30% gender balance on boards and C-suites around the world, and 30% of all women. So we don't just focus on one particular type of woman in each country. We want this to be on the basis of the 50% majority, and that 50% majority is made up of very different women with very different experiences and backgrounds. We focus our work on just three things. The first is around engaging chairs and CEOs so that companies put plans in place and are accountable. We're not an organisation that's in favour of quotas, because quotas become a compliance issue. Instead, we are much more in favour of the idea of organisations setting targets for themselves, which means they then become accountable for their progress. The second area that we like to do is to influence at a national level. As we have more and more businesses behind what we do, it makes us an easier conversationalist when government is looking at particular initiatives. So in Ireland, for example, the 30% Club started in 2015, and today we have 305 supporter organisations, and those 305 organisations represent almost 700,000 of the workforce in Ireland, which is a significant number. So it means we can be a good voice for business when the government are looking for feedback and ideas around gender representation, around areas like flexible working and agile working. And we would have been one of the few groups to present to the Joint Oireachtas Committee on gender balance across business and life in Ireland. And they're some of the areas that we like to get involved with and speak on behalf of business with a business voice. And the third area that we focus on within the 30% Club is around talent pipeline. How do we work with our member companies to make sure that nobody can ever say, well, I wanted to make a gender-based appointment, but the talent doesn't exist. The talent does exist, and we want to help that. So there are a number of initiatives that we run in the talent pipeline space. Some of them are in every chapter where the 30% Club operates. So I think at this stage we have the largest global mentoring program, but some of them are quite specific to each individual country. So just to give an idea of some of the things that we do in Ireland in this space. So we have a partnership with all of the main universities in Ireland who offer us scholarships in the executive education space, where we still don't see enough women progressing. And we know executive education is really important in terms of career progression. So we offer 25 to 30 scholarships a year for mid-career women who are interested in executive education. We have our mentor program. We have a board-ready program that we run with Deloitte, where each year we take 30 senior executives who are really interested in a board role, and we help them think through the process and put themselves in a mindset where they will put themselves forward. We work with DCU and UCD and Maynooth on a program to help training teachers come into organisations and see how STEM subjects are used in the workplace. So when they go out to be teachers, they can then talk to young men and young women about why maths is important, why science is important, and what those trainee teachers saw in the world of work. And these are just some of the examples of some of the things that we do. Because I have a chance to go and talk to more than 300 companies on a regular basis, I get to see the common threads around what Irish companies are focusing on. And when I talk about Irish companies, I talk about companies working out of Ireland. So we're really unusual here in that we have a unique combination of listed companies, private companies, large state employers, and also multinational employers as well. So it gives us an opportunity to have lots of different viewpoints. But typically what we see our members focusing on when they're building out their diversity and inclusion plans is 4 key areas that they look at. The first area that we see all of our companies focusing on is around raising awareness and engagement. There's no magic bullet in terms of how do you develop greater gender balance. There is no perfect solution, but instead there is a combination of different levers that work the best for your organisation. But those levers can only have impact when it's part of the conversation. So the most important thing that we see companies starting to focus on is awareness and engagement. And typically we see that being much more successful when it comes from the very top, which again is why within the 30% club, our main supporters are the CEOs, because that's where change happens. It also means 80% of our supporters on this journey are men, because more than 80% of CEOs are men. Because as a HR woman, I know what needs to be done, but I don't have the power to drive change. So we always start with the CEO message. What am I committed to as the CEO? How do I want to drive change within my organisation? And who wants to come on the journey with me? And how do I make sure that I'm hearing what will work for everybody, but what will work specific to our organisation, which might be quite different to the organisation next door. The second area that we see absolutely across every organisation focusing in this space is work on the talent pipeline. I worked in an industry where up to 1974, you had to leave your job as a woman once you got married. Now, that changed in 1974, and we believed that the lack of women in senior roles was just a function of time. And if we left things alone, it would happen, the change would happen, but it didn't. So what our companies are learning is that for us to make progress in talent pipeline, we have to have serious actions. So we now see companies putting very serious thought behind how do they recruit, where do they recruit, what does their policy look like, and what does the process look like? What are the barriers in the initial recruitment stage in terms of how we recruit? So for example, one of our industries are looking at the fact that they recruit almost on a 50-50 basis, particularly when they're doing their graduate recruitment. But what they found was that more women were being allocated to back office roles and more men were being allocated to front office roles, which was where the opportunities for promotion were highest. So while they were doing something really good at the point of intake, the value of it was being lost very quickly. So we now see companies starting to think about what does our talent process look like at every stage. It's not enough to look at it at the board and at graduate recruitment or point of entry, but we have to look at it at every point along the way. What does our investment look like in leadership development? Is there a bias in that investment? What do our training programs look like? How do we advertise our positions? What do we look for? We have now seen evidence that if a job ad goes out with 10 requirements, women are less likely to apply unless they feel comfortable that they meet all 10. Whereas men are more comfortable to apply when they can tick a couple of the requirements, but they know that they can learn on the job and they will give it a try. Women tend to like to be, some people call it risk averse, I like to call it more risk informed. But how do we not encourage women to say, do you meet all 10, but encourage companies to stop asking for 10 things and to think about how do we move talent through the organisation in a different way. The third area that we see organisations focusing on is how do they build a more modern workplace? Because the reality of it is most of our workplaces, particularly prior to the pandemic, were designed by our grandfathers for our grandfathers and our fathers. Workplaces weren't really designed for men and women equally to progress their career. So what we're starting to see is that in a more modern organisation, employees, both men and women, are looking for ways of work that flex with their lives. And in some ways, the greatest benefit that we saw out of the pandemic in Ireland was the huge shift change around the acceptance of remote working and more agile working. Prior to 2020, a small number of companies were starting to think about it, but we still had companies saying this wouldn't work for us, or our customers would never accept having a conversation with somebody on Zoom or Teams. The pandemic changed that overnight. have tried to make those changes across industry, it could have taken decades. But the step change meant overnight, unless your company was directly involved in manufacturing or direct care services, everybody moved to remote working overnight. But how do we make sure that it's not just taking the work practice that we used to do in the office and just moving it to another location? So we're now seeing companies starting to think about, where does work get done? When does work get done? And in what way? The last thing we want to do is reinforce the idea that remote working means that employees, women in particular, can do a day's work, go home at 5 o'clock, take on childcare responsibilities, and log on again at 8 o'clock and do an extra half a day. It doesn't necessarily mean that one group of employees come to the office and another group of employees stay at home. It's more creating a culture where I have a little bit more control. Particularly if I'm in a household where both of us go to work. It's the simple things. Who is there for the plumber when we have a leaking tap? Who goes to the parent-teacher meeting? And it's not just about those with family responsibilities. We're also seeing the younger generations saying, well, I don't have children, but I still want control over my day, and I still want to work in a more modern way that reflects my life. And the fourth area that we see organisations focusing on, we call it mind the gap. It's not about the pay gap, but it's about the idea of family leave absences. So we still see the idea that family leave, whether it's maternity leave, parental leave, paternity leave, is a gap in the career, as opposed to seeing it as part of the career. So typically, if we're now looking at a workforce that might work for 40 or 50 years, 10 months for maternity leave is a small part of that. 3 months for parental leave is a small part of that. So we're now seeing companies focusing on how do we make going on family absence and coming back from family absence a much more streamlined process. And a process that makes sure it has the least impact in terms of outcome, in terms of well-being, and also in terms of career. Not just for women, but for men. Because we see men wanting to take family absences, wanting to have higher involvement, but they see women struggling because their companies aren't always set up for this to happen well, and they're saying, I don't want to be treated that way. But these four areas raise lots of questions. And the questions are hard questions to answer because they're around behaviours. So the kind of questions we tend to see, particularly as organisations start to set targets in terms of progress, they say, well, what about merit? I want to be promoted on the basis of merit, not because of my gender. I want to be promoted on the basis of merit, not because of the colour of my skin. Merit and targets are not mutually exclusive. They can both work closely together, but if an underrepresented group are being over-promoted in your organisation, then there's already something wrong with your merit process. So what we're trying to say is, let's level out the playing field and remove the barriers, because if X% of my organisation are men, then that same percent should be coming through in promotions, and the same in terms of women. We're starting to see conversations around, let's change the system. In the early days, the conversations were around, how do we make women more confident? How do we make women more open to the idea of a career? How do we move women? How do we change women? How do we help women build the leadership characteristics that have been successful in the past? Now we're starting to see conversations around, how do we change the system so that men and women can be themselves and still progress through? We're really starting to see the need for allies and advocates. It's very hard when you're the minority in the room to speak up. And that's where the idea of 30% came from. 30 is not about equal representation. 30% is about the number of voices you need in a room to change the conversation. And typically across a team of 10, you need one voice and 2 allies. in terms of changing the conversation. We're also seeing companies talk about the extra I. So many companies have focused on diversity. How do I bring in more balance in terms of my employee base? And they then realise they don't get the value out of that unless they talk about inclusion. How do I make sure these voices are heard? But many companies started the journey just looking at diversity and inclusion, but it didn't change the numbers at the top. So they're now talking about how do I drive change in roles of influence? How do I make sure that there is gender balance at the conversations that drive change? Yes, in every conversation, but it's really important in terms of the big conversations where decisions are made. And then finally, we're starting to see organisations integrate diversity and inclusion into their business strategy so that it's no longer a standalone. And that's because they've seen in the business case that they need it for better customer outcomes, they need it in terms of procurement processes, they need it in terms of shareholder and stakeholder expectations. And then finally, we are seeing companies really looking at how do we put diversity and inclusion into our DNA. It's not just about celebrating International Women's Day or Pride Day or National Wellbeing Week. It's about how do we build it into the type of company that we want to be. So we're seeing companies starting to think about it in terms of their purpose, their mission statement, which then means how do we build diversity and inclusion into our values? Because ultimately, organisations are seeing they can have the best policy in the world. If I don't experience that as an employee, if I don't see that in the behaviours of my leaders and my colleagues, then this is not a comfortable place for me to stay with, and this is not a comfortable place for me to deploy my talent. D&I is a long journey. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about it today.